Okay. Um, so David, I really enjoyed your book, Laboratories of Autocracy, and I would like to talk about, really it's concerned with the same thing that I'm really concerned about, which is what I see as a war on democracy by a powerfully anti-democratic right that is hell-bent on establishing authoritarian rule, displacing democracy with authoritarianism, currently in the form of Donald Trump, but he's just the able tool of, or the central, he's the central figure, but as always with authoritarianism, the story is not the figure around whom it revolves, but around the people who follow him, because and how they come to follow him and why. And I feel that this book addresses it from a different angle than I normally do, but it was really powerful. And I wanted to go at it. Essentially, your argument is that the right has essentially rigged the game for democracy by taking over power at these local levels and particularly at the state level.
Right.
And then rigging the game afterwards, once they have obtained power, rigging it so that they remain in power and cannot be displaced. And it's a certain recipe for minority rule, which is in fact what we are seeing us move towards in this country, and certainly what we saw during the Trump years. And you start out, of course, talking about Ohio, which is a world away from me, a state I've actually never visited. But you do a good job of selling it. Can you talk a little bit about why Ohio reflects the broader nation so well?
Sure. And the point of my book, as I try to make clear, is I spent a lot of time in Ohio in the book, but the book's about the country.
Yes.
And what I'm describing happening in Ohio, as I say, this is a state that voted for Obama twice. It had a 10-8 Democratic delegation as recently as 2010. And now we look like this deep red state that's been governed like we're Alabama. If it can happen here, it can happen in a lot of places, is the point. And it is happening. But I go back to the history of Ohio, that if you talk to any Ohioan, they'll tell you, we thought of ourselves as the heart of it all. We were this manufacturing, powerhouse. We had, great education. We had great people coming from here, proudly so. We reflected the country as the quintessential swing state, but also we had sort of moderate down the line politics where there was a lot of balance. If you had a Republican in charge in Ohio, they were generally like a George Voinovich, a little more moderate. And if you're a Democrat, you had to have enough sort of authenticity like John Glenn to win over Republicans. So we sort of represented, not just because of our electoral college total votes, but because we were this swing state, you sort of represented this more moderate world. And so I go through how all that's changed rapidly. And people like me, I was literally elected, named at least, most likely to be president of the Cincinnati Board of Tourism in college or law school, because I always brag about Ohio. And as I say in the book, we all do. But if asked now about Ohio, the story's horrible. Like, our public outcomes are cratering. Our state house has been named, or our state politics have been named the most corrupt in the country, which back in a few years ago, I would never have thought we would be named that. And they're legislating, again, like we're Alabama or Mississippi, and it's never changing. It's this downward spiral of poor outcomes, corruption, lack of democracy in the end. And those go together. So I try and use Ohio, this story, and Ohioans, I'm already hearing, they all relate to it. Like, yeah, what the hell's happening? Why is this all happening here? And I think it's a case study. Without democracy, all these things are almost inevitable. Corruption that comes with a state house where people don't feel like they can ever lose, but the private players surround them. Terrible public outcomes because there's no longer any incentive to deliver good public outcomes. But the necessity to keep rigging it all, so that when you see these horrible outcomes and you get so extreme, you have to keep democracy from reappearing or you'll lose your offices. So it's this system that sort of is self-reinforcing in a downward direction, and it's accelerating here and it's accelerating in the same way elsewhere. So
sort of a race to the bottom.
It really is, and everything sort of each keeps building on the other. The more extreme, the more you have to have gerrymandered districts to stay in power.
Right.
The more corrupt, the more you got to protect yourself. And so this is, and I think one of the things to try and point out is there was a lot of people who rigged these districts in 2011 after Karl Rove was very sadly adept at targeting state houses to flip. I don't think they even thought through how warped the consequences of an entire generation of politicians without democracy. It's far more sort of extreme in how, I don't even know the right word for it. Like I said, warped it is than I think people probably thought it would get. Like these are people who largely, and when I say largely, I'm not talking about, they have generally a 60 to 39 majority, something like that. It's not like 30 of them are guaranteed the re-elections and the other 30 have to fight for them. We're talking about almost every member of the majority is guaranteed a re-election by at least double digits, and most of them 50 out of 99, 20 points or more. I mean, these are people who just literally have not experienced democracy in their own rise to power, and they're afraid of democracy. And Ohio is a sort of this glaring case study of what happens when you've had that for a generation. But sadly, Missouri or Tennessee or Florida, they're all seeing the same thing as Ohio is.
Well, and one of the things that I deal with all the time is the sort of psychological dimension of this, in terms of how and why people are attracted to extremist movements and conspiracism and extremist belief systems, and ultimately authoritarianism, which is what all of those things lead to.
Right.
And it's just really abundantly clear that these horrible social outcomes that you're describing, economic and otherwise, have a really powerful effect of driving people towards this sort of extremism, driving them towards adopting conspiracism, because the world is seeming increasingly chaotic to them, right, and they're looking for security, and authoritarianism offers them that.
Yeah.
And so it's really, in every dimension, it is a fast worsening problem, and it doesn't, I don't know where we even see the bottom to it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I don't get into that side of it in my book, but it connects to that. And
well, but I compliment what I'm reading, and you're
exactly
with what I know too.
But I think the personalities of the legislators versus 15 years ago are reflecting that now.
Yes, absolutely.
In a way that they wouldn't have not that long ago. I mean, we're seeing it in Congress with the Madison Cawthorns and the
Jim Jordans.
There are hundreds of these people in state houses. And here's the worst part. At least right now in Congress, they're not in the majority, so they're just talking or videotaping themselves. In state houses, they're voting in the majority on laws that affect our districts and our voting rules. Correct. So, imagine that psychology within the minds of multiple, hundreds of legislators who actually right now have the power and are acting on it to rewrite the laws of our democracy as we speak.
Right. And that's why, I mean, you have this chapter on weaponizing state houses into a national force.
Right.
And that's exactly what we're looking at, is that they are, that a lot of the Republican program is not being advanced by Congress, because actually Republican Congress isn't doing a thing. They're not passing a thing. They're just stopping anything from being passed.
Yeah.
But in the Republican state houses, they're actively passing these anti-voting laws, anti-abortion laws, the anti-CRT laws,
Yeah.
all of these things, laws that make it legal for people to run over protesters with a car.
Yeah, if I keep thinking about that last one in particular, if we saw another country do all these, but particularly that one, my guess is we'd almost issue sanctions that this country has fallen away from democracy so badly that we would treat them differently. And what's frustrating for me is we have a blind spot when it comes to our own country. We just assume that everyone buys into the democratic project, small d. And so when these series of things, attacks on courts and elections offices and independent offices and trying to crack down on protests of those we don't agree with, to vigilantism being encouraged, everything else we've talked about, rigging of districts, in our own country, if that was another country, as I said, we would raise the alarm. My gosh, they're moving away from democracy. In our own country, I worry as I watch it, we compartmentalize each one. Oh my gosh, there's that bad law and there's this bad law. And most people are not saying together, these are collectively just an attack on the fundamental pillars of democracy, as you said. And as you said when we started, the lesson of our history here and elsewhere is when all those things happen, you do get autocracy. You see, once you rip all those pillars away and you normalize it, it doesn't take very long for the place to flip. And that's what we've seen, in Hungary and other places. So it's a pretty
Turkey,
disturbing scene. And I worry, and I wrote this book. I started writing in April. I was not planning on writing a book. I didn't put together some proposal for somebody. I wrote the book because I see all this happening, a little bit of arm's length since I stepped away as chair of the Ohio Party. And I just don't sense that there's an urgency among people in DC or really broadly. Worse, I sense a lull that we're just kind of letting it happen. We're not seeing it for what it is. So I wrote the book as my own sort of feeling like, well, everyone's got to do something. I have a perspective from Ohio that shows how bad it is. Let me share it. Because I worry that people are not putting it all together for how bad it really is.
Yeah, it seems to me that there is, people are so wedded to the necessity to believe that things will be normal, that things can be normal, that they're really blinkering themselves as to the reality of what we're dealing with right now. People just don't want to see it. They don't want to know about it. And of course, there's a huge chunk of the population out there that pays zero attention to politics anyway, because they don't believe it affects them. And I think the next few years may give them a really rude awakening. But more than that, I think within the mainstream Democratic Party, as well as within the mainstream media, there's really this desire to believe that things can be normal again. Well, we can go back to normalcy. And I don't see normal returning for a long time, and especially not if we don't start putting our shoulders to the wheel.
Absolutely. I think that we will not have normal again until there's accountability in multiple ways. And there needs to be accountability for January 6th. There needs to be accountability for Trump and corruption that he brought. But the other thing that's happening is there is no accountability anymore in state level politics. The reason they never stop attacking constitutional rights, be they voting rights or women's right to choose or whatever, even when their laws that they pass are struck down, they never lose their office. They never are, every once in a while there's a corruption prosecution, normally by the feds, because within states, they just don't happen against their own party. But there's so rarely any accountability that there's never any pushback to a more normal politics. Right. Even when, again, this Texas law, I don't think it's been ruled on today. I haven't seen, if it has been, I haven't seen news, but My guess is that Texas law will be stopped by this court because in the mechanism of that lawsuit, sort of part of it. But in a normal world of politics, attacking women's right to choose in that way would actually cost people their offices in the next election. But in our current politics in these state houses, we're essentially no longer working within democratic governance. I mean, these state houses are no longer small d democratic. They're about to get worse. And so these folks they keep doing this and they never stop because there's never accountability. So normalcy can be achieved if over the coming years, we start getting accountability back into the conversation. Right now, there's just almost no accountability for the most, anti-democratic behavior we're seeing.
Yeah, and you see that, I think, as the key to reclaiming democracy, standing up for it, right? That pushing, creating accountability for all of these. And I would
that's
toss
a big
in there,
part of it.
I would toss in there accountability for police too, but
yeah, it's a big part of it. I mean, I think that the reason, and it's a metaphor, but it's really how they're working. The reason these state houses are, as my title describes, state laboratories of democracy,
right,
is because they can keep going through thick and thin, through being found to have violated the law. They never stop. In Ohio, we saw it after the Obama win. They went after every part of the Obama coalition they could, and oftentimes they would fail. They would be struck down. They would write a law poorly, but they would win their next election because they're guaranteed to win. They do it again and again. It was on the third time of trying, they succeeded in getting rid of the week where people both vote and register at the same time. It took them 3 tries. But if there's never accountability, they just keep pushing and pushing. And so I think accountability is part of it. And I also think there's a lot of other things we have to do. I mean, we can go through it all, but that's one key piece, though, is I think unless there's accountability, unless they fear a consequence from truly, undemocratic and often illegal behavior, illegitimate behavior, unless there's any fear of a consequence, of course they're going to keep doing it. They have all the incentive to do it. They never pay a price for doing it, and they just keep going.
What are some of the other things you think are key to reclaiming democracy?
I mean, I will say, and I don't want to blame an entire party because I think most Democrats in Washington agree with this. The federal government has to act. If this window closes, and hopefully we win the House and the Senate in 2022, but if we don't, and the window closes, and they have not passed robust voter protections, as well as protections against the most egregious gerrymandering. I have a 7 and a 4-year-old. They will spend much of their lifetime fighting to get back to where we are right now if they don't act in the next year. So the federal government has to, and there are other ways the federal government has to act as well. I think they need to double down on protecting all the rights that these state houses are attacking, be it, again, women's right to choose or union rights. I mean, they're literally using these states to undermine national rights, federal rights, and federal law. And then, again, in the national sense, and in my book, I go through a lot of steps that I hope are very practical for everyday people to act upon. But before we get to those, and those are necessary, but federal action is essential. Without it, the history is pretty clear. If there's no federal pushback on this, at least our history tells us the attacks on democracy succeed. That's what happened that led to Jim Crow. But I also think we have to rethink our politics, because one side, the Koch brothers and ALEC and their allies, this is a war on democracy. They think their freedom and democracy are inconsistent and essentially mutually exclusive. So they're warring against democracy every year, everywhere. Our politics is still based on the presidential calendar and the Senate calendar and the swing states that are in play in those races, or some of the swing congressional districts, which means they're on offense every year, everywhere. We contest in some states every 2, and essentially every 4 years. Well, if that's the terms, they're going to win. They're all, my older kid plays soccer. Like, if one team's on offense the entire time and you're on offense every once in a while, you're going to lose. So we have to rethink this all as a long game for democracy that we have to fight everywhere, and we need to schedule our action accordingly. We need to use our resources accordingly. We need to think about running for office accordingly, and we're catching up in that mindset, but we're years behind. And this sounds a little bit like, well, you really want to move some money away from the presidential year spending and put it into state house races? The Koch brothers did. Look what happened. It worked.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes.
Yes.
If you took some percentage, 5 or 10% of your presidential year multi-billion-dollar spending, and you spread it out among 50 states for 4 years, you not only would protect democracy better, you'd actually do better in the presidential year because you'd be building something. And so we have to really rethink, I think, the way we frame politics. And the other advantage to thinking about this way, Stacey Abrams is the best example. Once you define it in this way, you realize it's a long game. It's like a John Lewis long game for voting rights, or the suffragists long game for women's suffrage. And then you start to see that the result is not determined by every result of every cycle. We often have one bad cycle, we quit, we fire everybody, we start over. Stacey Abrams told us, even when she lost her governor's race for a lot of reasons, that as she explained, were really illegitimate, she gained progress in that loss. She registered people, she fired up people, and that progress carried over to 20 in a way that we turned Georgia blue. Yes. Just like running in every single state house district in every state, you're going to lose most of those races. We know that. But we should celebrate the fact that we're running in every district, because every one of those candidates will register voters. They'll change minds at every door. They will have higher turnout. And maybe in 2 or 4 years, if they do it again, and we've seen this in states like Virginia, they win the next race. So we've got to define it as a long game. And that means you see progress even in tough years if you're doing it right. And we've seen that in Ohio. We've seen that in other states. And the other thing we got to do, back to the broader politics, there are multiple elections that impact democracy. In Ohio, our biggest priority, especially when we realized that the National Party, although they support us generally, they didn't see the presidency as coming through Ohio. I get that. They thought they could win Virginia and Michigan. That's life. That didn't stop us from prioritizing winning Supreme Court seats.
Right.
Because in our state, after we changed the Ohio Constitution to end gerrymandering, we knew that we needed a balanced Supreme Court to protect our new language. And we won 3 elections in 4 years. We have a balanced Supreme Court. I think it will save us from the current attempt at gerrymandering. So in some states, it's secretaries of state, and others, it's state auditors, and others, it's courts. Focus on all the races that impact democracy, not just the ones that, have the most exciting U.S. Senate candidate going. So there's a lot to do. But once you define it as a battle for democracy, your priorities, they don't change completely, but all of a sudden, there's a lot more you can do, and you can define success in a different way than just what happens every cycle, at one level.
Yeah, I can't help but kind of reflect that the abandonment of Howard Dean's 50-state strategy after 2008 was really symbolic of Democrats losing their way on this. Because I thought the 50-state strategy reflected the recognition that these local races, even though you're going to lose them, they still matter. Having a presence in these communities. I can tell you, as someone from Idaho, which used to be actually a pretty purple state, I was mentored by Frank Church. That a lot of the transformation of these states into red states has a lot to do with the sort of with basically Democrats having abandoned rural areas because and focusing all of their, from a certain strategic numerical sense, it makes sense to focus on our urban areas where you're going to get most of the votes. But I think abandoning rural America has had catastrophic consequences for the Democratic Party. Uh,
No, and I would say the other thing we do, and I experienced it here in Ohio, like when one of our states moves to red, even a little bit, like we had Trump won Ohio a couple times.
mhm.
That was terrible for Ohio. You don't quit on that state, because
Right.
then you take their temporary gain and you make it permanent. Did they quit when Virginia went for Biden by what, 8 or 10? No, they went
Right.
back and won it a year later. They almost won in New Jersey. They're fighting everywhere. And we too often, you and I, you've been around long enough, like I have. Missouri was pretty competitive not that long ago.
Right.
I
Right.
don't want Ohio to be Missouri, where all of a sudden it's like, oh, we think of it as a red state. We invest like it's a red state. We have to. By the way, Jamie Harris is a friend of mine. He's trying to up investment in red states. So I think the party is catching up. They realize that Howard Dean was right. For a while, they didn't do this. They're trying to catch up now. So I give Jamie credit. I think he's from South Carolina. He understands this.
Right.
But I do think that we have a tendency to just wash our hands of certain states once they feel red, not compete there. And then, like you said, it's a downward spiral from there.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think there's a great case, and I've done some videos on this. There's a great case to make in rural America that trickle down is what's killing them.
Yeah.
And infrastructure, like infrastructure that was just passed, they need that as much as anybody. They need healthcare as much as anybody.
Yep.
But what I've learned in Ohio, and I've tried to explain this to folks in the administration, if we don't go right to those places and say to them, this infrastructure plan, you may not believe us, it's actually for your town too. It's not just for the city of Cincinnati and the very big bridge we have here. It's for your needed flood wall or your small street. Unless we actually really go to these places and say that, not through a big speech, but by walking down the street and looking at how terrible these towns are, the shape they're in, they don't think it's for them. They think it's for somewhere else. And I think we have to be, whether it's Pete Buttigieg or Marcia Fudge, who knows Ohio well, or Tom Vilsack, or Biden and Kamala Harris themselves, they got to go to these towns and walk them and say, this is for you. And then in a year or two, those towns need to see that their streets look better, or they have broadband. But unless we do that, they just assume these things are for somewhere else. And so, but I think if we do it, and by the way, these towns pay the price of gerrymandering as much as big cities.
Right.
Because as I write in the book, that there's one town near me is dying. They call their state senator. They ask him, what are you going to do to help us? And he tells them, well, sometimes you just have to move. You don't say that unless you feel totally unaccountable to the voters. So these voters are basically, the people they elect are voting for a trickle-down privatization agenda that never helps these towns. It only hurts them. And gerrymandering makes those people feel like even if the local outcome of the places they represent is terrible, they feel so bold as to tell those people they should leave, as opposed to these guys being voted out of office. So I think the lack of democracy is really hurting these small rural towns as much as it's splitting up big cities.
Yeah, unfortunately, my experience has been that it's just about impossible to get that message across in places where Fox News is playing on the local cafe 24/7.
By the way, you don't have to get, but we don't have to get to 50% in these towns.
Right.
You just can't be at 20. I mean, and Obama was at 40. You don't even need to be at 40. If you look at how Sherrod Brown won Ohio, but you need to be close to 40. You can't be where Hillary Clinton was, or even Biden, like mired in the low 20s. So, but you're never going to get to high 30s if you don't show up and say what I'm saying.
Right.
And basically they're not doing that, I think, at least right now. But I do think that there's an opportunity with infrastructure and Build Back Better to go finally have something you can deliver to these places and be very explicit in making that clear.
So one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot in terms of the war on democracy that we're enduring is that, in a lot of ways, the strategic architecture of that war was present on January 6th. That we saw, that was actually what January 6th was in many ways. And it was my thinking about this came out of, reading this stuff about the memo that Trump had that outlined the plan to use the Senate and Pence to throw Congress into disarray, which would then throw the vote into question, and everything would be delayed, and they could contest it inevitably until state legislatures could vote on it, which of course was part of their plan, because they know they control these state legislatures, as you more brilliantly documented here. And at the same time, they were planning on this mob descending on the Capitol, which is of course what we all have noticed. What we all noticed at the time, people haven't been paying attention. And so it was a classic inside outside game thing, right? They were playing the game on the inside, but they also had an outside game with these mobs, with the radicalized insurrectionists who are willing to engage in violence in the name of defending Donald Trump. And that's so that I think is, and that's actually the architecture what we're looking at. So in a lot of ways, I really see your work and mine being incredibly complementary, but in completely different ways. But we're both looking. I'm looking at the outside game, which I think is important, but I think also we need to be really tuned into what's going on with this inside game, because that's the object. That's what's actually is their intent. Is changing the institutions themselves.
And what's scary to me is if they, the thinking they put into January 6th in that process that Eastman outlined in that memo, they came to it too late to have it have the impact they wanted.
Yeah.
Well, now they got
competent.
and they weren't competent. But now they have a 3.5-year head start. And like I say, they're always learning from their mistakes. And that memo or version of it will be in the hands of every state legislator, probably now or very soon. So they have a long time to get the inside game figured out better than they did on January 6th. And by the way, there's some overlap. We know that some state legislators were part of the insurrection, or were, part of Stop the Steal, or were doing other things. And so my worry is that the outside game matters, because those legislators think, wow, we've got some really passionate people who really agree with us. But my biggest worry about 24 is if they stack the deck enough through the legislators who decide how states send their electors to DC on January 6th, they can do almost everything they did on January 6th without storming any buildings.
Right.
They can take care of it. They can have legislators. You get the same memo that Pence basically in the end rejected. And those legislators will say, yeah, we'll send a different delegation, or we'll contest a delegation. And, Speaker McCarthy or whoever will be the one making decisions. So my great fear is that the outside and inside are both there. But if they really work the inside well, they can do everything they try to do on January 6th without anything looking as illegitimate as storming a building. And the greatest fear is that you see these countries that the academics call competitive autocracies. They have the feel of democracies, but they're not legitimate because everything's predetermined. My deep worry is that's what they're trying to do here. And the key to that succeeding is the look and feel of legitimacy. And if state houses are voting for things as part of their formal duties, most people think, well, that must be legitimate. The state house did it. And what scares me is that they're going to figure out that there's a cleaner way to get the results they want without storming a building and attacking police and everything else they did. And I can't imagine they're not all working on that as we speak. And that should scare the heck out of everybody.
Yeah, I think that, well, I actually also think that, that same architecture could very well be in play for us in state races in 2022.
Absolutely.
I think of states like Texas or Florida, which could very well have very close gubernatorial races, and which, and I believe both of those states have passed laws that actually empower local official or the legislators to overrule local electors,
Right.
if I'm not mistaken, so that they could actually seize these governor's races through clearly illegitimate means. And yeah, I imagine that there would be some protests out there, but from the left, from liberals, people demonstrating against it. But now at the same time, we have the right all ginned up to go what they call, what the Proud Boys are telling leftist protesters right now is, if you show up on the street, you're going to get Rittenhoused.
Right. Is
So
that what they're saying?
that's become their new euphemism.
Let alone
So,
what the laws that are literally giving people no liability if they hit someone with a car.
Right.
We're obviously seeing
Right.
how deadly that can be. So
Yeah.
no, it is, and I just, some of my book gets into history, and the specter and actual, execution of violence was a key part of what happened that led to Jim Crow. It was voter suppression.
Mhm.
It was courts not supporting rights to vote of particularly Black voters in the South. It was a federal government that over time let off
Mhm.
pushing for those rights, and it was violence accompanying it all. And that was the toxic brew
Yeah.
that took registration from hundreds of thousands or 100,000 down to 3,000.
Correct.
And so almost every element of one of the worst moments in American history, it's not as severe, clearly, but almost every element is literally rearing its head now that led to the end of democracy in the South and the holding back of our entire country, thanks to Jim Crow for almost all the 1900s.
Well, David, I want to really thank you for having put this book together, because I think it's really an important document for understanding this war on democracy. It's important for people to understand how significant, as you say, the inside game is the one that they can win even without the outside game.
Yeah. And one thing I try to do in the book, and I hope you'll mention this, is Washington has to act. Schumer has to act. The filibuster should not get in the way of protecting democracy. There's no legitimacy to that argument if you read the Constitution. But I also, in the book, try and outline that every single citizen can add protecting democracy as part of their own mission statement,
Right.
part of what they do, whether it's making sure every single state house race is contested, or whether we battle the purging through ourselves, figuring out how to make sure we're registering people all the time. So even though it's a pretty bleak first 2/3 of the book, I do try and give sort of a roadmap on how every single person who cares can actually play a role and not simply wait for DC, but in their own state. We need DC to protect, but the best way to go on offense as states is that people themselves go on offense at the state level and local offices. So I hope folks look at the book partly because there's a little bit of a guide based on my own experience and talking to some others on how every single person who's concerned doesn't have to give up because DC isn't acting, and hopefully DC does, but they themselves can take some ownership and try and fight back as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually the sort of toolkit everyone's looking for.
Yeah.
That, well, what can I do?
Exactly.
And I thought the book was terrific for that, because you went through not just how you can do it sort of broadly, nationally, and statewide, but in person-to-person interactions. And I found, as someone who wrote a book about how to deal with conspiracy theorists, I thought your advice was extremely sound. Essentially, it ultimately comes down to valuing empathy, valuing basic common decency, and maybe reminding our right-wing neighbors that, we actually are common, decent, normal Americans once in a while.
Right, absolutely.
Well,
Thanks for the conversation. I
you
appreciate
bet.
it. You're going to write an article up on this or a Q&A?
I'm actually going to just do, I'm going to do a transcript of this interview.
Oh, awesome.
So
Good.
I'm just going to send it off to Rev, have him give me a transcript, and whoops.
Awesome.
We'll.
Well, I really appreciate it. Good talking.
Yeah,
to you.
I'll have Cliff get me or maybe you could get me information on where and how people can get the book.
Okay.
Are you going to be doing any kind of tours?
I'm not sure. I mean, you know what I've been doing, and you can put this in there. I mean, I've done a lot of Zoom calls already with activist groups and book
Okay.
clubs. I mean, clearly a core part of my mission is to make sure people are just aware of this. And one of the reason the Koch brothers do this through State House is because they know that no one knows anything about it.
That's right.
That's part of the reason it works so well. So to me, the mission is through my book and other ways, get the word out. So if I'm not doing a tour, but if anyone is, and if you put this in, if there's an activist group, if there's a book club group or a local, an invisible group, I'm talking to all of them right now all over the country. It's actually been really, really positive.
And of course, you can get it through your local bookstore, right?
They can order it. I mean, you can get it on. The easiest thing to say is people can go to my website, laboratoriesofautocracy.com. That generally takes them to Amazon, and some people don't want to promote Amazon. They can go to a bookstore and order it there. People are doing that. What's that?
They can go to Powell's or some other site.
Yeah,
right?
and exactly. They could. I don't know if it's there. Most of my books have ended up there, but if it's not there, they can order it there to get it sent to them.
Yep. Okay.
Well,
thanks so much, David. And
thank you.
I'll send y'all a link when the piece goes up.
Wonderful. Take
All
care.
right.
Thanks so much.